Okay, we're going to read Christian history, the first 600 years, chapter 3, the crisis of Judeo-Christianity. The period from the year 70 to 40, or rather 40 to 70, was marked by two facts important for the Christian community. On the one hand, Jewish nationalism became more and more extreme, and the Judeo-Christians came under strong pressure from it. On the other hand, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 was a very serious blow to Judaism in general and to Judeo-Christianity in particular. Moreover, during this time, thanks chiefly to Paul's efforts, Christianity made progress among the pagans, and this led to the Christians from these groups to break away from their Jewish context, though not without a difficult crisis. At the end, there occurs a reversal of the earlier situation. Judeo-Christianity, triumphant in 49, collapsed, while Pauline Christianity began its triumphant destiny. At the threshold of this period, the Council of Jerusalem took place and laid down lines to be followed. At the end came the fall of Jerusalem, which decisively settled certain questions. The year 49 was marked by two events which show a crisis had arisen between Judeo-Christians and Gentile Christians: the Council of Jerusalem and the Antioch episode. The chronological link between these two events is at present disputed. The Epistle to the Galatians, the only one to mention the Antioch episode, places it second. The difficulties opposed to this order seem to be based on a priori grounds, so this order will be followed here. Paul returned to Antioch in 48 with Barnabas. He had described the results obtained among the pagans of Asia and the new prospects lying ahead. Gentile converts were not obliged to submit to Jewish practices, notably circumcision. This was the case of an Asiatic, Titus, whom he had brought with him. And now in 49, men came down from Judea, disturbed by the community of Antioch, by teaching that circumcision was obligatory for all. Many scholars have seen in these men Judeo-Christians holding James' point of view, opposed to Paul, who represents the Gentile Christians. Gregory Dix has rightly criticized this theory. The Judeo-Christians, who then comprised nearly all the church, admitted from the start that converted pagans were not obliged to undergo circumcision, as Peter recalls, Acts 15, verse 10. So the obligation to be circumcised must, on the contrary, be something new. To what must we link it? Evidently to the political situation of Judaism, which had come into open conflict with Rome. Christians were still considered to belong to the Jewish community. For them to admit non-circumcised members appeared an act of treason toward Judaism. So it was under the pressure of Jewish nationalists that certain Judeo-Christians tried to uphold Christian membership of the Jewish community, of which circumcision was the seal. What was at stake is quite clear. The danger was to link Christianity with the temporal destiny of Israel. Paul and Barnabas understood this clearly and strongly opposed these demands. By doing so, they appeared as representatives of the Judeo-Christian community itself, and not as innovators. Nevertheless, seeing the gravity of the dispute, the Antioch community wished it to be laid before the apostles in Jerusalem. Acts 15, verse 2. Paul and Barnabas were sent with Titus, Galatians 2:1, and were received by the apostles and the elders. There the debate began again. Certain Christians of the sect of Pharisees defended the theory of circumcision of the Gentiles. Peter, in the name of the apostles, James, in the name of the elders, decided in Paul's favor, pointing out that the pagans were only obliged to carry out the Noachic principles: abstinence from food sacrificed to idols, meat of strangled animals, and fornication. Paul and Barnabas, joined by Silas and Jude, named Barsabbas, were sent to transmit the decision to Antioch. This important decision marked the break between Christianity and the Jewish community, which was to become accentuated in the next few years. Important for the history of the relations of Christianity and Judaism, The Council of Jerusalem was also important for the development of the Christian community. The variety of the men taking part is noticeable. Peter and John represented the 12. Peter had left Jerusalem in 43. His presence in Jerusalem was accidental. Either he came for the council, or a period of relative calm on the part of the Jews allowed him to return. James, surrounded by the elders, represented the local community of Jerusalem. Silas and Jude, named Barsabbas, appear to have belonged to the elders. They are named hegumens, leaders. The word seems to be synonymous with presbyters. It is found in the Epistle to the Hebrews, 13:7, 17:24, and the Epistle of Clement, 1:3. The council also included Paul and Barnabas, who had the same rank as Peter and James. They were accompanied by Titus, who at the missionary level had the same rank as the elders. In this picture, we see the organization of the hierarchy taking shape. The 12 formed a rank apart, but in charge of the church as a whole, now stationary, now moving about, with whom every church had to be in communion. Peter had a special rank among them. Paul was assimilated to them. Beside them were two parallel hierarchies. On the one hand, the local hierarchy, composed of the Council of the Elders, also called episcopes or hegumens. At their head was a president, who was sometimes a man of the first rank, like James of Jerusalem, who possessed all the powers of the apostles capable of being shared, and who alone had the power to institute elders. On the other hand, there was the missionary hierarchy, apostoloi, didascali, or prophets. It also included men of the first rank, like Barnabas, who participated in the powers of the apostles. The movement from one hierarchy to the other, as in the case of the Hellenist deacons, the hegumens of Jerusalem, and the presbyters of the Didache, shows their equivalence. The Council of Jerusalem had definitively settled the question of the circumcision of the Gentiles, but the nervousness of the Judeo-Christians, stirred up by nationalist considerations, was not thereby calmed. We see this soon afterward. At the end of 49, at the time of Peter's journey to Antioch, Peter was present at Jerusalem for the Council of 49, but the situation of the Jerusalem community was more and more difficult. The real work lay elsewhere. It was during his journey on a new mission that Peter stopped at Antioch. At the beginning, he would have divided his time between two communities, the Judeo-Christian and Pagano-Christian. But on the arrival of people from James's circle, he stopped eating with the Pagano-Christians, and Barnabas followed suit. Paul reproached them sharply for this. Some say that this was an act of cowardice on Peter's part. Gaester seems to be nearer the truth when he shows that Peter and Paul were concerned with opposite considerations. For Paul, who thought of the Pagano-Christians, it was essential to free Christianity from its Jewish links, whereas Peter feared the risk that the Judeo-Christians, under the pressure of Jewish nationalism, might return to Judaism. He wanted to keep them by showing that it was possible to be loyal both to the Christian faith and the Jewish law. It was doubtless in order to ask him for a gesture of this kind that James' men had come. The 2 points of view were equally legitimate, but they were irreconcilable. Paul, at this moment, gave up Judeo-Christianity as lost and thought only of the church's future among the Greeks. We can understand the hostility of Judeo-Christians toward him, which was later expressed in the pseudo-Clementine writings. Peter, on the other hand, despite the situation of the church in Judea, seems not yet to have lost hope of keeping a Judeo-Christian community, and perhaps he saw very far, just as far as St. Paul. But in fact, our information about the events of Antioch comes only from the latter. His view is one-sided and amounts to special pleading. Without accusing him of distorting the facts, we may well consider that he gives us only one aspect of them. In any case, the incident gains its full meaning if placed in the framework of the double movement whereby Christianity is to spread among the Greeks, while the Jerusalem community is to dissolve in the rising tide of Jewish nationalism. The first movement, the expansion of Pagano-Christianity, was essentially the work of Paul and his colleagues. For tracing its development, there exists a remarkably rich documentation, historically the most exact of this period. The second part of the Acts, where Luke, who has become Paul's companion, uses the diary of his journal and the corpus of the Pauline epistles. Here we shall only note the chief stages. At the beginning of 50, Paul set out on a new journey. He crossed Syria and Cilicia and doubtless passed by way of Tarsus, his native town. When he visited the Christians of Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia. From there he broke new ground, Galatia, northern Phrygia, and Mysia. He left with Silas, one of the Hegemon prophets, who came to Antioch with him from Jerusalem, and joined Timothy in Lystra and Luke in Mysia. The first two were to remain associated with Paul's missionary work and were to be his proxies. But the striking event in this mission was Paul's journey to Europe, with the consequent foundation of the churches of Macedonia, and Achaia. So it looks like this has a couple of plates in it. Isaiah scroll from Qumran open at Isaiah 40. So I'm going to just take a moment to read this. This scroll probably dates from the 2nd century BC and was almost certainly used by the community at the time of Christ and in the earliest period of the church. It is made up of 17 sheets of somewhat coarse parchment, sewn together and amounting in all to about 24 feet 6 inches in length. In this picture, the column, which is completely visible, contains in its second line the verse of Isaiah 43, quoted at the beginning of St. Mark's Gospel. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. You can see it. In the second plate, plate 2, the ruins shown here are perched on a plateau surrounded on 3 sides by steep ravines, about a mile from the west coast of the Dead Sea. There are traces of an early Israelite settlement on the side, probably from about the 8th century BC. But most of the ruins belong to communities that lived here between the mid-2nd century BC and 68 AD, judging from the MSS discovered near the site. The community was a closely disciplined group, which looked upon itself as the true Israel, called to be separate from the historic Israel and summoned to a life of work, prayer, and study of the law in the wilderness. So there's the ruins. In Macedonia, he stopped at Philippi. Back to the reading. In Macedonia, he stopped at Philippi, where he converted several pagans. Denounced and arrested by the Roman authorities, Paul made use of his title of Roman citizen. At Thessalonica, he spoke in the synagogue and converted the Jews, but he also converted some Greeks. The same thing happened in Berea. From there, he went to Athens, where he preached to the Areopagus in the presence of Stoics and Epicureans, but he had little success there. Then he went to Corinth, where he stayed for 1.5 years. This stay can be dated with certainty. On the one hand, he met 2 Jews, Aquila and Priscilla, who had a weaving business and with whom he worked. Aquila and Priscilla had just been expelled from Rome by Claudius. Suetonius mentions this edict, which was dated 49. Moreover, the proconsul of Achaia was Gallio, who, according to an inscription at Delphi, exercised this office in 52. So the stay at Corinth ran from the beginning of 51 to the summer of 52. It was from here that Paul wrote the 2 epistles to the Thessalonians. He then returned to Antioch by way of Ephesus and Jerusalem. In spring of 53, he left on a new journey. Again, he crossed Galatia and Phrygia, but this time his goal was Ephesus. He preached not only in the synagogue, but also in a school for the pagans. He stayed there nearly 3 years, and it was from there that he wrote the epistle to the Galatians and the first epistle to the Corinthians. His plan was to return to Jerusalem by way of Corinth and Rome. In fact, he stopped in Macedonia and arrived at Corinth at the end of 57, after Titus had rejoined him. During the winter, 57 to 58, he wrote the epistle to the Romans. He then went to Philippi, embarked upon Troas, and arrived at Tyre by ship, having touched at Miletus, he arrived in Jerusalem for Pentecost. So the balance sheet of Paul's missions shows a credit. Between 50 and 58, he founded the churches of Macedonia, Philippi and Thessaloniki, and of Achaia, Corinth. But what the Acts all allow us to glimpse, and what the epistles, somewhat sadly, reveal, is the growing opposition which he did not cease to meet from the Judeo-Christians, aroused against him by Jewish nationalism. An opposition which led the day of the Lord was close at hand. It is difficult not to see this in this a political disturbance of a messianic kind, which recalls that Josephus tells us about Jewish rebels at this time. It is against their influence that Paul wrote his 2 letters. In Ephesus, he was preceded by Apollo, an Alexandrian Jew who had instruction in the way of the Lord, but he knew of no baptism except that of John. He had founded a community. He went to Achaia about 54, and we find him again in Corinth. He seems to have been at the bottom of the difficulties mentioned by Paul. What, then, did Apollo teach? He showed that Christ was wisdom, Sophia, come down into the world and ignored by its rulers. 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 through 11. Paul did not condemn these speculations, but he reproached Apollo for making a gnosis out of Christianity. What did a Jew mean by gnosis at that time unless the Apocalypse, which reveals the heavenly secrets, the names of the angels? This gnosis was especially prevalent in Essene circles, but it was also found in Egypt among the Therapeutae, who were related to them. It was from this group that Apollo came. Converted by Priscilla and Aquila, he retained in his Christianity this speculative turn of mind, which appears also in Judeo-Christian writings like the Ascension of Isaiah. This throws light on Asian Christianity. During his second journey, the Holy Spirit had turned Paul aside into Asia. When he came there, from 54 to 57, he found Judeo-Christians with the same tendency as Apollo, and met sharp opposition from Judaizing groups. Later, he was to speak of his opponents there. 1 Corinthians 16:9. So it seems that Paul faced a very powerful Judeo-Christian community, over against which he had tried to found a Gentile community. Later, he was delivered to wild animals, 1 Corinthians 15:32, as a result of the hostility shown to him by the Judeo-Christians. In 51, he again clashed with the Judeo-Christians of Ephesus, 1 Timothy 1:3. Then in 63, he complained that everyone in Asia had abandoned him, 2 Timothy 1:15. Simultaneously, with disturbances among the Corinthians, and after those among the Ephesians, influenced by Apollo, disturbances took place in Galatia. Here, the situation is even clearer. The Galatians returned to Jewish practices, having been freed by Christ. They returned to slavery, and the obligatory observance of the law even by the Pagano-Christians. More particularly, they attached importance to special days and months, special seasons and years. Galatians 4:10. A study of Jewish apocalyptic writings in the time shows the importance given to the calendar as an expression of the ordering of time by God. This importance was linked to the expectation of the eschatological event. One could not have a clearer expression of the spirit of underlying Jewish zealotism. This contained 2 elements. Fanatical attachment to legal observances, and 2, a sharpening of the eschatological hopes. It was these tendencies which stirred up the Galatians. What we witness is a Judaization of Christianity. Paul found himself in the winter of 57 in a dramatic situation, supremely expressed in the Epistle to the Romans. A powerful current of revolt against Rome was shaking the Jewish world, and this also affected many Christians. Their conflict with Paul was not dogmatic, and there was no question of 2 Christianities. It was a question of Christian situation with regard to the Jewish community from which they came. To deny circumcision appeared a political treason, not religious disloyalty, and to betray the Jewish community was to place Christians of Jewish origin in a difficult situation, expose them anew to Jewish persecution, drive them to despair and apostasy. The old problem raised at Antioch was still developing, but it had become sharper. Wise and outstanding men, Peter, Barnabas, and others, thought that concessions would have to be made to safeguard a Judeo-Christianity, which was still in the majority as regards numbers. Paul was afraid that even his companions would abandon him. The absence of Titus distressed him. Moreover, he was persecuted by the pagans at Philippi and Ephesus, mocked by the philosophers at Athens. He may well have wondered whether he was not mistaken and was ready to make concessions. He advised the Corinthians to avoid scandalizing people by eating meat offered to pagan deities. But the certainty of the voice which had spoken to him prevented him from weakening. In 58, this conflict gave rise to a dramatic crisis. In coming to Jerusalem, Paul knew that he was courting danger. Acts 20:22. He was received by James and the elders, and the latter informed him of the charges the Jews were making against him. He was turning the Jews away from circumcision and their customs. They advised him to make a public act of loyalty as a Jew, so Paul went to the temple. But some Jews from Asia recognized him and stirred up a riot against him. They accused him unjustly of having profaned the temple by introducing a pagan into it. He was arrested by the Roman soldiers, but having announced that he was a Roman citizen, he escaped any ill treatment. A discussion took place before the Sanhedrin, followed by a new tumult, and a group of Jews planned to assassinate him. The tribune then sent him to Caesarea, to the procurator Felix, who was in office from 52 to 59. Felix realized that he was innocent, but kept him in prison for 2 years. In 59, he was placed by Festus, 25:27. He was replaced by Festus, 25:27. Acts 25, verse 27. The Jews demanded that Paul be brought back to Jerusalem, but Paul appealed to Caesar. Festus decided to send him to Rome. First, he was questioned by Agrippa II and his sister Berenice, who were convinced of his innocence. Starting in this year 60, events succeeded one another rapidly. In Rome, Paul remained on probation from 61 to 63. It was then that he wrote the epistles to the Colossians, to the Ephesians, to the Philippians. The epistle to the Colossians bears witness to Judeo-Christian activity in Phrygia. Questions about forbidden food and about the calendar were raised by him and disturbed the community. Paul did not condemn these uses as bad, but they belonged to an order of things which was obsolete. Elsewhere, he put the Colossians on their guard against speculations about angels, which were a feature of Jewish apocalypse. Christ on the cross has dispossessed principalities and powers. Paul also pointed out that what he was witnessing also concerned the neighboring towns of Laodicea and Hierapolis. We shall see later that these towns were Judeo-Christian fiefs. Paul announced that he was also sending a letter to the Laodiceans, but he probably never wrote it. Freed in 63, Paul resumed his missionary work. Our information for this final period is contained in the epistles to Timothy and epistle to Titus. The conflict with the Judeo-Christians increased, and Paul went to Crete. Shortly afterward, he wrote to Titus, whom he had left there in order to institute elders in each town, and put him on guard against Judeo-Christians. They lent an ear to Judaic fables, muthoi, the technical term for the millenarian dreams, and insisted on regulations about food. Paul advised Titus to leave aside disputes about genealogies, that is to say, speculations about the angels, and about the law, that is to say, Jewish observances. The 2 epistles to Timothy were directed at the situation in Ephesus, where Paul had gone, doubtless after his journey to Crete. With him he had Timothy, to whom he entrusted the church of Ephesus when he left for Macedonia. And it was from Macedonia that he sent him instructions. This is the first of the 2 epistles. It was first of all a question of fighting those who taught fables and genealogies. They only created divisions. Paul must guard what had been entrusted to him, and avoid this quibbling knowledge that is knowledge only in name, pseudonymous. This last word means Judeo-Christian speculations, and was later to be used by Irenaeus to designate Gnosticism, which was a branch of them. These Judeo-Christians also forbade marriage and the use of certain foods. Timothy evidently let himself be influenced, for Paul recommended him to drink wine. Here a new feature of Judeo-Christianity is in evidence: syncretism, which forbade marriage and wine. Syncretism was chiefly a feature of Palestinian and Mesopotamian Judeo-Christianity. It shows that Judeo-Christian missionaries continued to be active in Ephesus. Another feature of the first epistle to Timothy is important. Paul gave instructions for the organization of the community of Asia, similar to those that he had given to Titus for Crete. There was a college of presbyters with a president who was one of its members. More specifically, he was given the title of bishop, episcopus, which suggests the function rather than the dignity. There were also deacons, directly dependent upon the bishop. There are thus two parallel hierarchies, the one more collegial, the other more monarchical, with the bishop as the link. These two hierarchies were often to come into conflict. The emphasis placed by Paul in the pastoral epistles on the institutional hierarchy has raised doubts as to their authenticity. Some have argued that the situation they describe is at variance with that found in the epistles to the Corinthians, but the situation described seems in fact to correspond to the date in question. We merely have a substitution of an ordinary local hierarchy for the missionary hierarchy. At this period in Syria, the same development is found in the Didache. 2 years later, when Paul sent Timothy a second letter, the situation had grown still worse. Paul was gloomy. Men no longer heeded healthy teaching. They opened their ears to fables, muthoi. The false apostles made their way into house after house, captivating women. The part played by women was a feature of the Judeo-Christian sects and was to reappear later in Gnosticism. They were like Jannes and Mambres, the opponents of Moses and Aaron and the Jewish tradition. In particular, Hymenaeus and Philetus taught that the resurrection had already taken place. Later, we find this claim in Cerinthus. It was a sign of the sharpening of apocalyptic hopes. Everyone abandoned Paul in Asia. Judeo-Christianity had never seemed so triumphant as at this time, but in fact, it was on the eve of its defeat. At Rome, during the time the drama broke out, July 64 was the date of the burning of Rome. Nero had been reigning since 54. He placed responsibility for the fire on the Christians. The accusation may have been aimed at the missionary disturbances of certain Judeo-Christian groups, so it was still linked to the same atmosphere. Peter seems to have been one of the victims of this persecution. Most historians today are agreed on this, and it is not impossible that it is his tomb, which has been found on the Vatican Hill. It is possible that certain Judeo-Christians denounced him, as a passage in 1 Clement 5:2 seems to suggest, and still more the narrative of Tacitus, who speaks of a denunciation of their co-religionists by the first Christians to be arrested. Paul was again a prisoner in Rome, and everything suggests that the same conditions prevailed as on the first occasion. He then wrote the second epistle to Timothy. We can date his death at 67. Doubtless he too had been denounced by the Judeo-Christians to the Roman authorities as a troublemaker. During this time, the situation had deteriorated in Palestine. In 62, James, Bishop of Jerusalem, was stoned. The date is attested by Josephus, who records the event twice, and its date as the year when the procurator Festus was replaced by Albinus. This coincides with the accession to the high priesthood of a member of the family of Annas the Younger. Hegesippus gives a more detailed account than Eusebius of James's martyrdom. In this case, it would seem to have been the Pharisees who feared the influence of James on the people. This would supply evidence of mounting anger against the Christians, doubtless because of their refusal, even among Judeo-Christians, to commit themselves to anti-Roman messianism. In 66, this nationalism reached its climax. The Jewish war began, and the Christian community then withdrew to Pella in Transjordan, which was equivalent to breaking its links with Israel's national identity. It was headed by Simon, Jesus' cousin, who had succeeded to James. This action, more than any other, marked the church's definitive break with Judaism. The community of Jerusalem had tried right to the end to keep in touch with the Jews and work for their conversion to Christ despite persecution by them. Henceforth, it would leave Israel to march to her destiny. In 70, Titus captured Jerusalem, massacred the Jewish population, and razed the temple to the ground. That concludes chapter 3 of the Christian centuries, the first 600 years.